Arthur and Julia Whitlock, who had raised 5 successful children through decades of sacrifice, now found themselves abandoned. All they had left was a pickup truck bound for the scrapyard and their old German shepherd, Ranger. The rain was relentless that day, soaking through Arthur's coat as he watched the bailiffs load their furniture onto the truck. Each piece held a memory. Julia sat in the pickup, an oxygen tube clipped to her nose, one hand resting protectively on Ranger's head. The dog hadn't left her side since the foreclosure notice arrived 6 weeks earlier. Their eldest son, Bradford, approached, a designer umbrella shielding his tailored suit. His wife, Grace, waited in their Range Rover, deliberately avoiding eye contact. "Father, you can't keep living beyond your means." Bradford held out a plain brown envelope. "The Pinecrest nursing home has an opening. They've agreed to take you both next week." Arthur stared at his son. "A nursing home? We're not invalids." "Bradford, your mother needs proper medication and care." "Yes, and they can provide it. The fees are reasonable, and they have excellent medical facilities for mother. They just don't allow pets." He glanced at Ranger. Arthur's voice cracked. "Ranger has been with us through everything. We mortgaged this house to save your restaurant. We paid for Diana's law school and covered Kevin's gambling debts. 47 years here, and you want us to abandon our family?" "He's a dog, Dad, not family," Bradford sighed. Grace finally emerged from the Range Rover, her designer heels clicking on the wet pavement. "Arthur, be practical. You're both sick, broke, and frankly, you're a burden we can no longer afford. That dog is just one more mouth to feed." Julia struggled out of the truck, her oxygen tank trailing behind her like a reluctant shadow. "We gave you our savings, our retirement, the equity in our home. We chose you over our own security, and you won't even let us keep our dog." Diana walked up, holding legal documents in a waterproof folder. At 45, the lawyer daughter had perfected the art of emotionless efficiency. "We've arranged for Ranger to go to a shelter. It's the most humane option, given your circumstances." "Humane?" Something inside Arthur finally snapped. It wasn't his heart. It was the last thread of his patience. "I worked 60-hour weeks at the factory for 30 years so you could become a lawyer. Your mother destroyed her lungs in textile mills to pay for your education. And this is your definition of humane." A heavy silence fell, broken only by the drumming of rain on umbrellas and the rhythmic hiss of Julia's oxygen. Bradford handed Arthur a set of rusted keys. "Grandfather's old mining claim in the Rockies. It's all we can offer. The cabin is still standing, mostly. Maybe the mountain air will help Mom's breathing." His expression softened for a fleeting moment. "But Dad, seriously, that dog won't survive a winter up there. He's old, just like—" He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung in the air. "Just like you." Arthur's voice hardened into something even he didn't recognize. "Ranger goes where we go. There is no discussion." The children exchanged a look, part exasperation, part relief at having done the bare minimum. As they drove away in their luxury vehicles, Arthur unfolded the note left in the envelope. "We'll visit when we can sort things out. P.S. There's a vet 80 kilometers from the cabin, if you insist on keeping the dog." Julia's voice, barely a whisper, brought him back. 50 years of marriage. We raised 5 children. And this is how our story ends." Ranger whimpered softly and licked her hand, as if promising it wasn't the end. The truck's headlights finally illuminated a weathered sign. "Welcome to Ravens Hollow, Est, 1952. As they rounded the last bend, the truth became clear. There was no town, only the skeletal remains of an abandoned mining settlement. The headlights swept across collapsed structures, rusted equipment, and in the center, their new home. A log cabin with half its roof caved in, its windows shattered, and a porch that sagged like a broken jaw. "My God," Arthur whispered. The betrayal, already profound, deepened as he understood the true nature of his children's gift. Ranger barked once sharply and leaped from the truck the moment Arthur opened the door. Instead of fleeing into the wilderness, a fear that had haunted Arthur the entire drive, the dog began to methodically circle the property, nose to the ground, as if establishing a perimeter. "What's he doing?" Julia asked, her breath creating phantom clouds in the frigid air. "Being smarter than our children," Arthur muttered. "He's making sure it's safe." They had $847 in cash, a week's worth of canned goods, Julia's essential medication that would run out in 12 days, and a 50-pound bag of dog food that had seemed adequate in the valley. But now, at 8,000 feet, felt precious and finite. Inside the cabin, the devastation was total. The collapsed section had allowed snow to drift into what might have once been a living room. A rusted wood stove listed to one side, its flue disconnected. The kitchen sink had long ago pulled away from the wall, and animal droppings suggested various species had taken up residence over the years. Arthur sank onto an overturned crate, the enormity of it all crushing him like the weight of the mountain itself. "I failed you," he said to the empty room. "I gave them everything." He looked over at Ranger, who was shivering despite his thick coat. Maybe they had been wrong to bring him. Julia's oxygen concentrator struggled in the thin air as she moved slowly to his side. She took his wrinkled hand, her free hand scratching behind Ranger's ears. "Arthur Whitlock, we survived the Great Recession. We raised 5 children on factory wages and buried our parents with dignity. The 3 of us are not done yet." Her eyes glinted with a resolve he hadn't seen since her diagnosis. "Besides," she continued, gesturing to the faded welcome sign barely visible through a broken window, "we're not the first to start over in these mountains. And Ranger here," she said, stroking his fur, "has more loyalty in one paw than our children have shown in 50 years. As if on cue, Ranger suddenly tensed. His ears pricked forward, staring into the darkness beyond the broken doorway. A low growl rumbled in his chest. Not aggressive, but alert. "What is it, boy?" Arthur followed the dog's intense gaze but saw nothing but swirling snow. "He's always been able to sense things we can't," Julia said. "Maybe that's exactly what we need up here." Ranger walked to the door and waited, his posture a clear command. "Follow me." Against all logic, Arthur hesitated. Where could he be going? It's too cold out there. But Julia was already reaching for her oxygen tank. "I trust him more than our children right now. Let's see what he's found." They followed Ranger through the snow to what appeared to be a root cellar 20 yards from the main cabin. The door was nearly buried, but the dog began digging with focused determination, clearing away the snow until Arthur could get a grip on the frozen handle. Inside, lit by Arthur's flashlight, was a concrete room filled with jars of canned goods, decades old but still sealed, along with stacks of dry firewood, basic tools, and, most astonishingly, a small propane heater with 2 full tanks. "Someone prepared for winter," Arthur whispered. "Not just someone," Julia corrected, pointing to initials carved into the wall. "EW 53, your grandfather, Emmett Whitlock." Ranger sat beside them, his tail sweeping the dusty floor, an almost smug look on his face. "Well, I'll be," Arthur whispered, stroking the dog's head. "Good boy. You're a very good boy." That night, they slept in the truck, the propane heater running intermittently, Ranger curled between them for warmth. Outside, the blizzard howled its displeasure at their survival. But for the first time since leaving their home, Arthur slept without despair crushing his chest. He woke in the morning to find Ranger sitting alert in the truck window, staring intently at the mountainside behind the cabin. The storm had passed, revealing a landscape that was both brutal and breathtaking. Ice-dusted pines stood guard around the clearing, and the rising sun turned the snow-capped peaks into flame-tipped monuments. "What do you see, boy?" Arthur asked. Ranger whimpered softly and pawed at the window. Beside him, Julia stirred. Her breathing seemed worse this morning, the altitude taking its toll. "Is something wrong?" "I don't know. Ranger is fixated on something up there." Arthur squinted, seeing nothing out of the ordinary among the trees and rocks. "Check his bowl," Julia suggested, but Ranger's food and water remained untouched. The dog continued to stare at the mountainside with unwavering focus. Later, while Arthur assessed the damage to the cabin, calculating what could be salvaged, Ranger maintained his vigil. The dog would periodically circle the property, nose to the ground, then return to stare at the same section of mountainside. By midday, the pattern was too obvious to ignore. "I think he wants us to follow him," Arthur said at last. "I don't know if I can make that climb," Julia breathed. Arthur faced an impossible choice: follow Ranger's insistent guidance or stay with Julia, whose every breath was a struggle. "You two stay here," he decided. "I'll go see what has him so worked up." But Ranger wouldn't budge without Julia. When Arthur tried to set off alone, the dog planted himself at Julia's side, refusing to move. "He won't leave you," Arthur realized. "Whatever is up there, he thinks you need to see it too." Determination flashed across Julia's face, the same look she'd had when doctors told her she'd never see her youngest daughter graduate. She had proven them wrong then. "Then help me with the portable tank," she said, reaching for the small oxygen supply they'd reserved for emergencies. The climb was agonizing. Every few yards, Julia had to rest, leaning against a tree or a boulder, her breathing shallow and rapid despite the oxygen. Arthur's heart ached watching her struggle, but Ranger remained patient, waiting whenever they stopped, then encouraging them onward with soft barks once Julia had recovered enough to continue. They had climbed perhaps 400 meters when Ranger shot ahead, disappearing behind a cluster of boulders. His excited barks echoed down the mountainside. "Ranger!" Arthur called. "What did you find, boy?" When they rounded the rocks, the sight stopped them both in their tracks. Nestled in a natural depression was a steaming pool about 30 feet in diameter. Its waters were crystal clear and lined with smooth stones. Despite the freezing air temperature, tendrils of vapor rose from the surface, creating a mystical haze in the winter sunlight. "A hot spring," Arthur breathed, the wonder of it momentarily erasing his fatigue. Ranger stood proudly at the edge of the pool, his tail wagging, clearly pleased with himself. He dipped a paw in the water, then looked back at them expectantly. Julia's scientific mind, which had helped her children through decades of science projects and math homework, sparked to life. "Geothermal activity, probably rich in minerals. People pay a fortune at spas for water like this." Arthur helped her to the edge where she sat on a flat rock. She trailed her fingers through the water, then brought them to her face. It smells like my grandmother's mineral supplements. Sulfur, magnesium, maybe. Ranger barked once, then did something extraordinary. He began to dig at a spot several feet from the pool's edge. Within moments, his paws uncovered the corner of something metal protruding from the earth. Arthur knelt beside him, brushing away the soil and pine needles to reveal a rusty metal box the size of a large book. Stamped on the lid were the faded words, E.W. Whitlock, 1953. "Another gift from your grandfather," Julia whispered. Inside the waterproof container, they found a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed but intact, along with geological surveys, old letters, and a faded photograph. The picture showed a man who was unmistakably Arthur's grandfather, Emmett, standing beside this very pool. Sitting next to him was a German shepherd that was the spitting image of Ranger, his posture alert and proud. On the back of the photo, handwritten in faded ink, were the words, "God's pharmacy cures what medicine cannot." Rex discovered it first, as dogs always do. Ranger sniffed the photograph, then Arthur, his intelligent eyes seeming to say, "History repeats itself." As the winter sun began to set, Julia slipped off her shoes and, with Arthur's help, dipped her feet into the warm waters. The effect was almost immediate. The tension in her expression melted away. The lines of pain around her mouth softened. "It feels like it's seeping into me," she murmured. "Like breathing underwater, but in a good way." When darkness threatened, forcing them back to the van, Julia walked with noticeably less effort. Her breathing, though still labored, had a different quality. Less desperate, more rhythmic. That night, huddled in the camper with Emmett's journal open between them, they read by flashlight about the spring's remarkable properties. Water runs hot even in the dead of winter. Sarah's arthritis vanished after 3 months of soaking. The children's skin cleared. Rex led us to it on our 3rd day here, as if he knew what we needed. I believe this place chose us, not the other way around. Ranger lay at their feet, lifting his head occasionally when his name, or perhaps Rex's, was mentioned, as if the stories were familiar on some ancestral level. Further in the journal, they found entries about various pools, each with different mineral compositions to treat different ailments. There were notes about locals who came for secret treatments, about offers from pharmaceutical companies. One letter offering 50,000 reais in 1953, nearly $500,000 in today's money, and about Emmett's decision to keep the springs a family secret. The final entry, dated a month before Emmett's death, read, "The mountain holds its secrets for those who need them most. Rex's pups have scattered across the country, but I believe one will return someday, when the springs are needed again. Dogs remember what humans forget." Arthur looked at Ranger. "You knew, didn't you?" he whispered. "Somehow you knew." Julia's hand found Arthur's. "Our children gave us nothing," she said softly. "But maybe their nothing is everything we need." The dawn arrived with an Arctic brilliance, sunlight refracting through ice crystals, casting prismatic patterns on the snow. Arthur awoke stiff from another night in the truck, but with a clarity of purpose that had eluded him since retirement. Beside him, Julia slept more peacefully than she had in months. Her breathing was less ragged, despite the night without her oxygen concentrator, which had finally run out of power. Ranger was already out of the truck, standing alert beside the cabin, as if waiting for the workday to begin. When Arthur emerged, stretching his aching back, The dog trotted over and nudged his hand, then looked meaningfully at the collapsed roof. "You're right," Arthur muttered. "We can't live in the truck forever." His first instinct was to call for help, perhaps a contractor from the nearest town. Then reality came crashing back. They had less than $850 to their name, no cell service, and a road that would likely remain impassable for weeks. Arthur squared his shoulders. He looked at the cabin with new eyes, not as a hopeless ruin, but as a project. For 35 years, he had maintained industrial equipment at the factory, improvising repairs when parts were unavailable, keeping ancient machines running on sheer ingenuity. "This is just a big machine that doesn't move," he said to Ranger, who tilted his head as if considering the perspective. Julia emerged from the truck. "I feel different," she said, a note of wonder in her voice, touching her chest as if something had loosened inside her overnight. While Arthur saw the spring as their secret, something to be enjoyed in private, Julia immediately grasped its potential. "We need to make the cabin livable," she declared, "and then create a path to the spring that I can walk every day." That became their first project. A footpath from the cabin to the spring, lined with flat stones and reinforced with timber salvaged from crumbling outbuildings. Ranger helped by dragging smaller branches in his teeth, dropping them exactly where they were needed, and waiting for a nod of approval before fetching more. Arthur had forgotten the satisfaction of physical labor, not the grinding factory work that wore down his body, but purposeful creation. Every stone set, every section of path leveled, was immediate, tangible progress. By the third day, Julia could make the trip to the spring with minimal help, and each soak seemed to strengthen her further. The portable oxygen tank, once her constant companion, was now usually left behind. "The minerals," she explained, reading from Emmett's journal. "They're reducing the inflammation in my lungs. Listen to this." She read about a mining accident in 1955, where 3 men with coal dust in their lungs recovered after 2 months of daily soaks. The cabin itself proved more challenging. The collapsed section had allowed water damage to weaken the remaining structure. Arthur, working methodically with tools salvaged from Emmett's root cellar, removed the rotted sections before they could compromise the foundation. "Grandfather built this place to last," Arthur observed. "The central frame is still solid. It was only the additions that failed." Ranger displayed an uncanny knack for locating useful materials. The dog would disappear into the surrounding woods or toward abandoned mining structures, returning to bark insistently until Arthur or Julia followed. His discoveries included a cache of preserved lumber in a fallen storage shed, intact windows in the mine supervisor's office, and most valuable of all, solar panels from a more recent installation, likely an attempt at modernization before the settlement was abandoned. "How does he know what we need?" Julia marveled. "Maybe he can smell grandfather on things," Arthur suggested, though he didn't fully believe it himself. The dog's most remarkable find came 2 weeks into their renovation efforts. Arthur was struggling to devise a heating solution beyond the wood stove, worried about the smoke in Julia's lungs. Ranger vanished for nearly 3 hours, returning caked in mud and buzzing with excitement, barking until they followed him to what looked like a maintenance shed half buried in the hillside. Inside, under decades of dust and debris, they found an intact propane heating system, newer than the original settlement, likely installed during a brief revitalization attempt in the 1980s. The tanks were empty, but the system itself, with some cleaning and minor repairs, was functional. "It's exactly what we needed," Arthur said, examining the furnace. That evening, as Julia soaked her feet in a small basin of spring water they'd brought back to the van, she made a startling observation. "Arthur, look at this." She held out her legs, pulling up her trousers to reveal her ankles. The edema was gone. For years, Julia's ankles had swollen painfully by the end of each day, a side effect of her heart medication. Now they looked normal, the skin smooth instead of stretched and shiny. "And that's not all," she continued. "My morning stiffness is better. I can make a fist without my knuckles screaming." She demonstrated, curling her fingers into a tight ball, something that had been impossible without pain for nearly a decade. Arthur sat down heavily on an overturned crate. "The springs," he said, "they're actually healing you." "Not just me," Julia said, pointing to his hands, which had been working tirelessly on the repairs. "You've been hauling lumber, swinging hammers, kneeling on hard surfaces. When was the last time you took your arthritis medicine?" Arthur blinked. The bottle remained unopened in their medical kit. He flexed his fingers experimentally, then rotated his perpetually sore shoulder. The familiar ache was noticeably duller. "I thought it was just being busy. A distraction." "It's the springs," Julia insisted. "You've been washing up in the water I bring back every day. And look at Ranger." The dog, hearing his name, lifted his head. His eyes were clear and bright. His movements throughout the day had been energetic, despite the high altitude and his advanced age. Even the gray around his muzzle seemed less pronounced. Arthur turned back to Emmett's journal with renewed interest. The entries on the spring's healing properties, which he had initially dismissed as exaggeration or wishful thinking, now demanded a closer look. One passage in particular caught his eye. "Each pool has its own character. The North Spring eases the bones and joints. The East Pool mends the skin and wounds. The largest one, by the lightning-struck pine, seems to help the lungs and heart. Rex always leads visitors to the right waters, as if he can sense what ails them." "Multiple springs," Arthur murmured. "Ranger only showed us the one." Julia's eyes lit up. "The one that would help me breathe. The one we needed most urgently." The next morning, they followed Ranger back to the first spring. But this time, instead of settling in for Julia's customary soak, Arthur asked, "Can you show us the others, boy? The other springs?" Ranger's ears perked. He trotted once around the familiar pool, then set off across the mountainside, looking back frequently to make sure they were following. The path was more challenging, cutting along the slope rather than climbing it, and Arthur supported Julia carefully over the uneven terrain. After 15 minutes, Ranger disappeared behind a rock outcropping. When they caught up, they found him sitting beside a second, smaller steaming pool, this one surrounded by unusual reddish-hued stones. "The East Pool," Arthur whispered, remembering the journal's description of skin and wounds. This water had a slightly different smell, less sulfuric, with a hint of iron. Arthur dipped his hand in, feeling the smooth, almost silky texture. On impulse, he submerged a small cut he'd gotten while working on the roof, watching in amazement as the angry red inflammation visibly subsided within minutes. Ranger allowed them only a brief inspection before moving on, leading them to a third pool hidden in a grove of aspens. This one, true to Emmett's description, was beside a massive pine tree scarred by a lightning strike that had somehow survived a blast that had split it nearly in two. The water here had yet another character, clear, but with a bluish tint and a distinct mineral aroma. 3 distinct springs, 3 different mineral compositions, each with specific healing properties. Julia was in awe, her scientific mind cataloging the differences. But Ranger wasn't finished. He led them to a fourth pool they hadn't seen mentioned in the journal. A small fount, less than a yard in diameter, nestled against the rock face and lined with unusual black stones. The water here was so clear, it was almost invisible, giving off no steam despite its warmth. "This one isn't in the journal," Arthur said. "Maybe it emerged after Emmett's time. Thermal activity can shift." Julia dipped her fingers in, then touched them to her lips thoughtfully. "It tastes different. Sweeter, somehow." Ranger approached this pool differently. Instead of his usual confident posture, he lay down beside it, resting his chin on the edge as if in reverence. When Arthur moved to touch the water again, the dog let out a soft, warning growl. "I think he's saying this one is special," Julia interpreted. "To be respected." By the time they returned to the cabin, they were both exhausted, but exhilarated by their discoveries. The full extent of their inheritance was becoming clear. It wasn't just a ruined cabin, but a natural pharmacy of healing waters. "Our children thought they were sending us into the wilderness to die," Julia said. "But I think, without meaning to, they sent us to the one place that could save us. The question is, what do we do with such a gift?" In the week that followed, they settled into a routine. Mornings were for cabin repairs, with Arthur focused on structural work, while Julia, growing stronger each day, organized supplies and began clearing ground for a spring garden. Afternoons were for the springs, with Ranger always guiding them to the pool that seemed most needed that day. The cabin gradually transformed from a ruin into a refuge. Arthur repaired the roof using corrugated metal salvaged from abandoned mine structures. He installed the recovered windows, sealing them tight against the mountain winds. Once cleaned and angled toward the sun, the solar panels provided enough steady power for basic lighting and to charge Julia's medical equipment. Their most ambitious project was a gravity-fed water system, which Arthur engineered using materials from the old mining operation's water supply. A series of pipes and filters carried clean mountain water directly into the cabin, where an improvised tank could be heated on the wood stove for washing. Ranger, incredibly, seemed to grasp the purpose of each improvement, often unearthing the exact materials Arthur needed before he even began to look for them. When Arthur was puzzling over how to insulate the north wall, Ranger vanished for hours, only to return and lead him to an abandoned storage shed that held industrial-grade insulation. "It's like he can read my mind," Arthur said to Julia one evening. "Or your grandfather's," she suggested. "Perhaps he left caches of supplies all over the settlement, and Ranger can somehow sense them." The physical changes in them were becoming impossible to ignore. Julia, who had once needed oxygen for even the slightest exertion, now moved freely through the cabin. Her persistent cough had subsided, and her complexion had changed from ashen to a healthy pink. Arthur's arthritic pain had diminished so drastically that he could kneel on the cabin floor to install baseboard heaters, something that would have been unbearable just weeks before. Even Ranger showed a remarkable vitality for a 9-year-old dog. His coat gleamed, his eyes were bright, and he bounded through the deep snow with the energy of a much younger animal. "The springs are healing all of us," Julia observed. Their isolation remained total. The access road was still buried in snow, with no cell signal, no visitors. Yet, instead of the desperate loneliness they had feared, they found a surprising satisfaction in their daily routines and small victories. A month after their arrival, Arthur discovered a ham radio in the mine supervisor's office. With a few adjustments and parts salvaged from other equipment, he managed to get it working. They made contact with a ranger station 30 miles away, establishing their presence and location in case of an emergency, but they refused offers of rescue. "We're fine," Arthur told the ranger, the truth of the words surprising even himself. "We're just letting you know we're here." That night, they made a pivotal decision. Using the journal as their guide, they would formalize what had begun instinctively, creating a systematic approach to using the spring's healing properties. Julia, drawing on her love of gardening, designed terraced pools that would capture the different spring waters, making them more accessible. Arthur began sketching plans for simple shelters for changing and rest areas. Even Ranger took part, using his uncanny skill for finding materials and his seemingly innate knowledge of which ground could be disturbed without disrupting the spring's flow. 6 weeks after arriving as exiles, they stood together, surveying their progress. The cabin was now solid and weatherproofed, with a proper bed inside instead of the truck seats they had initially relied upon. A modest garden bed was prepared for spring planting, using soil enriched with minerals from the springs. The first terraced pool was nearly complete, lined with stones that Ranger had helped select, each one chosen with what looked like deliberate care for its size and shape. "We came here with nothing," Arthur said. "Now I feel richer than I ever did back home." Julia leaned into his embrace. "Our children cast us off like worn-out tools, but the mountain has welcomed us like family." Ranger sat alert beside them, his gaze fixed on the mountainside where the springs awaited their next visit. In the fading light, his profile looked remarkably like the dog in the EMTT's photograph, a guardian across generations, leading his humans to healing. That night, as snow fell softly outside, Julia made an entry in the journal they had started, continuing the legacy the EMTT had begun. Day 42, at Raven's Hollow. Arthur is asleep without painkillers for the first time in 15 years. My oxygen concentrator sits unused in a corner. Ranger grows more spirited by the day. The waters heal our bodies, but it is the purpose that heals our spirits. We thought our story was ending. Instead, it is just beginning. Spring arrived suddenly in the high country, as if winter had simply given up overnight. The snow receded up the mountainside, revealing meadows that exploded into wildflower bloom with an almost magical speed. The transformation of the landscape mirrored the transformation of Raven's Hollow itself. What had been a dilapidated cabin in a ghost town was now a cozy dwelling at the heart of a carefully tended homestead. Arthur had moved beyond basic repairs, adding a covered porch where Julia could sit in the sun, watching over her burgeoning garden. Solar panels gleamed on the south-facing roof, while a rebuilt stone chimney, using techniques Arthur had learned from the EMTT's journals, anchored the western wall. Ranger had established himself as more than a pet. He was a working partner in their daily life. The dog developed a morning routine of patrolling the property's perimeter, alerting them to the presence of wildlife, deer, elk, and the occasional black bear, which he would see off with strategic barking. Julia's garden defied conventional wisdom about high-altitude farming. Using water from the springs for irrigation, she produced vegetables of extraordinary size and vigor. Lettuce grew lush and sweet. Root vegetables reached maturity in half the expected time, and herbs flourished with intensified aromas and flavors. "It's the mineral content," she explained to Arthur, examining soil samples in jars of water. "These springs are feeding the plants just as they're feeding us." "I feel 30 years younger," he told Julia one night, as they soaked their feet in spring water brought up to the cabin. "It's like I've been given a second chance at my prime." "It's as if the clock is running backward," she marveled, examining her reflection in the polished metal mirror Arthur had made. Ranger, too, showed the effects of the springs. His muzzle, which had been quite gray when they arrived, now showed more black than white. His coat shone with health, and his energy seemed limitless as he bounded up the mountainside, often carrying tools or materials in a special harness Arthur had designed. The springs themselves were transformed under their stewardship. Following the EMTT's journals and guided by Ranger's inexplicable knowledge, Arthur built proper pools at each site, using reclaimed stone and timber to create soaking areas of varying depths and temperatures. Each spring now featured specific amenities based on its properties. The respiratory spring, with its effects on lung health, included a covered meditation deck where visitors could sit and inhale the mineral-rich steam. The joint spring was surrounded by comfortable, high-backed benches for support. The skin spring had a walk-in pool for full-body submersion. Only the smallest spring, the spring of reverence as they'd come to call it, remained minimally developed, accessible by only a simple stone path. Julia kept meticulous records, combining the EMTT's notes with her own observations. She created a catalog of ailments and which springs seemed most effective for each, noting ideal soaking times, water temperatures, and complementary treatments. A remarkable discovery occurred when Ranger began bringing injured wild animals to specific springs. A fox with an injured paw was gently nudged toward the skin spring. A deer with labored breathing was guided to the respiratory pool. Most dramatically, Ranger carefully approached a wounded eagle that had fallen in their garden and stood guard while Arthur, following the dog's clear signals, bathed the bird's injured wing in water from the skin spring. Within days, the eagle had recovered enough to fly. He isn't just finding things we need, Arthur realized, watching Ranger guide a limping rabbit to the edge of the joint spring. He's a healer in his own right. The journal entries from this period reflected their growing understanding of Raven's Hollow's special nature. Day 78. Julia's lung capacity is now at 89% of normal, a medical impossibility according to her last doctor. My arthritis has reversed to such a degree that X-rays would likely show cartilage regeneration. Ranger displays abilities that defy explanation. He seems to diagnose ailments in humans and animals, guiding each to the appropriate spring. We are witnessing miracles daily, yet they feel as natural as the sunrise. Their isolation gradually lessened as the mountain roads became more passable. On their rare trips to the nearest town for supplies they couldn't produce, they encountered locals who initially regarded them with the typical suspicion reserved for outsiders in remote communities. However, Ranger's presence served as an unexpected bridge. The dog's exceptional behavior and obvious intelligence sparked admiration, opening conversations that might have otherwise remained closed. Arthur and Julia were careful about what they shared, mentioning only that they were caretaking family property and enjoying the healthy mountain air. The first unplanned visitor arrived in early summer. A local hunter named Harold Jensen appeared in the clearing, leaning heavily on a walking stick, his face a mask of pain. "Truck broke down about 3 miles back," he explained, gesturing vaguely toward the access road. "Hips are giving me fits. I saw your smoke and hoped you might have a phone." Before Arthur could explain their lack of phone service, Ranger approached the stranger, circling him slowly, his nose working. Then, with deliberate purpose, the dog nudged Harold's trouser leg before trotting toward the path that led to the joint spring. "Your dog wants something," Harold observed. "He wants to show you something," Julia said carefully. "If you'd care to follow him, that is. Afterward, Arthur can give you a ride to your truck and help you get it started." Harold, whether out of pain or curiosity, agreed, Ranger led the procession down the now well-worn path, pausing frequently to ensure the limping man could keep pace. When they reached the joint spring, the dog sat expectantly at the edge of the pool Arthur had built. "What is this?" Harold wondered. "A natural hot spring," Arthur explained. "Rich in minerals, good for aches and pains." "Like a spa?" Harold asked, dubious. "More like old medicine," Julia suggested. "The kind your grandparents might have used before pharmaceuticals took over." Perhaps it was the pain, or perhaps it was the simple, direct way they presented the opportunity. But Harold eventually sat on a bench and, with Arthur's help, removed his boots and rolled up his trousers to soak his legs in the warm water. The effect was not instantaneous, but it came gradually over the course of 20 minutes. Harold's tense expression softened, his rigid posture relaxed, and finally, he spoke. "I've been to 3 specialists for this hip," he said. "Cortisone shots, physical therapy, talk of replacement surgery." He moved his leg experimentally in the water. "This feels better than anything they've tried." When Harold finally emerged from the pool, he walked to the bench with noticeably less difficulty. "What is this place, Ga?" he asked. "And how did your dog know what I needed?" "We're still trying to figure that out ourselves," Arthur admitted. "The springs have different properties. Ranger just seems to know which one helps with what." Harold nodded thoughtfully. "I had a bird dog once that could find quail where no other dog could. Some animals just know things we don't." He paused. "Would it be an imposition to come back sometime, for my hip?" Thus began a careful expansion of Raven's Hollow's reach. Harold returned, at first alone, then with his wife Margaret, whose arthritis responded equally well to the joint spring. They brought occasional gifts, homemade preserves, fresh game, useful tools, but more importantly, they brought discretion. They understood, without being told, that the springs were a private matter, not for general discussion. Through Harold and Margaret, a small network of local residents with chronic health issues began to make occasional pilgrimages to the springs. Ranger greeted each visitor with the same assessment routine, invariably guiding them to the spring that best suited their needs. Arthur and Julia established simple guidelines: visits by appointment only, no commercial activity, and a request for contributions toward upkeep rather than fees. These contributions, sometimes monetary, often practical goods or services, allowed them to improve the facilities without draining their own meager savings. By midsummer, their routine had expanded to include visitor days 3 times a week. Arthur would meet guests on the main road, in his refurbished truck, patched together with parts Ranger had scavenged from abandoned vehicles around the CR settlement. Meanwhile, Julia would prepare the springs and maintain their meticulous records. Ranger's role evolved beyond that of a mere guide and diagnostician. He became an integral part of the healing process itself. Visitors reported that his presence beside them during immersion sessions brought a sense of calm that enhanced the water's effects. For guests with emotional trauma or anxiety, the dog would sometimes simply rest his head in their lap, his steady gaze and rhythmic breathing seeming to anchor them in the present moment. One notable case involved a local teenager brought by Harold, who suffered from debilitating panic attacks after a car accident. Medication left the boy foggy and withdrawn, but after 3 sessions in the respiratory spring with Ranger lying by his side, he reported his first attack-free week in months. "That dog is worth his weight in gold," Harold declared. "Some people pay hundreds an hour for therapy that doesn't work half as well." Their operation remained small and intentionally discreet, catering mostly to locals with chronic ailments that conventional medicine had failed to resolve. They took no more than 8 visitors a day, preserving the peaceful atmosphere they had come to cherish. The transformative power of the springs was not limited to physical healing. Arthur and Julia discovered that their exile, initially seen as a cruel abandonment, had become a profound gift. Freed from the expectations and demands that had defined their lives, they found themselves growing in unexpected ways. Arthur, always practical and reserved, discovered a creative side through his continuous improvements to the springs. His walkways and shelters evolved beyond mere functionality, incorporating beautiful design elements. Hand-carved railings, stone mosaic patterns, and benches positioned to capture perfect mountain vistas. Julia, whose identity had been so wrapped up in motherhood and domestic duties, flourished as a researcher and healer. Her methodical documentation of the spring's effects became an invaluable reference, while her intuitive understanding of the visitor's needs complemented Ranger's diagnostic abilities. Together, they created something neither could have imagined: a sanctuary where healing occurred on multiple levels. Physical ailments improved, certainly, but visitors also spoke of emotional shifts, renewed purpose, and spiritual insights gained during their time at the springs. "We thought our useful lives were over," Arthur reflected one evening, watching the sunset paint the mountains in amber and gold. "Instead, we're doing more meaningful work than ever before." Julia nodded. "Our children saw us as a burden to be discarded. Now we're a blessing to people who truly appreciate us." Ranger suddenly lifted his head, his ears tuned to the access road. His posture was not one of alarm, but of alert attention. A familiar visitor was approaching. Minutes later, Harold's pickup truck appeared, but instead of Harold or Margaret, a slender woman in her 60s stepped out. She moved with the confident grace of someone comfortable outdoors and had a professional camera slung around her neck. "It's Dr. Sarah Brennan," Julia murmured, recognizing her from the local clinic they had visited for basic supplies. "Harold mentioned she was interested in the springs, but I didn't think she would come in person." Ranger trotted out to meet the newcomer, going through his usual assessment routine. After circling her once, he did something unexpected. He barked once, sharply, then raced back to Arthur and Julia before turning to lead Dr. Brennan down the path. "He's never done that before," Arthur noted, intrigued. "It's almost as if he's announcing her," Julia suggested. Dr. Brennan approached with an open, curious expression. "Harold's been raving about your healing springs for weeks," she said. "As the only doctor within 50 miles, I notice when my patients start canceling follow-up appointments because they're feeling better." Arthur tensed slightly, worried about potential trouble. But Dr. Brennan quickly continued, "I'm not here to interfere. I'm here because I'm fascinated, and because I have my own issues conventional medicine hasn't solved." She held up her right hand, which showed the characteristic swelling of rheumatoid arthritis. 20 years of veterinary practice took its toll. The irony of spending my career healing animals, only to find myself increasingly unable to perform surgery, is not lost on me. Ranger returned, gently sniffing Dr. Brennan's hand before looking meaningfully toward the path to the joint spring. "Your dog is remarkable," she observed. "Harold mentioned his diagnostic abilities. I was skeptical, but seeing it firsthand is impressive." She knelt to examine Ranger more closely, her veterinary training evident in how she approached him. "German Shepherd mix, about 9 years old," she estimated, "though he moves like a much younger dog. He's been rejuvenated by the springs, just like us," Julia explained. We were all in failing health when we arrived. Dr. Brennan's visit became a turning point in their understanding of Ravens Hollow's potential. As a medical doctor and scientist, she brought a valuable perspective to their observations. After experiencing the effects of the joint springs on her arthritic hand, regaining full range of motion within 3 visits, she proposed a more systematic documentation process. "What you've found here deserves a proper study," she said, "not to commercialize it, but to understand it. These effects defy conventional medical explanation." With Dr. Brennan's guidance, they began collecting more detailed data, before and after measurements, comparative photographs, and specific timelines of improvement. Her professional network gave them access to testing equipment that could analyze the spring's mineral content with a precision their homespun methods couldn't match. Most significantly, Dr. Brennan took a special interest in Ranger. Her veterinary background allowed her to observe nuances in his behavior that even Arthur and Julia had missed. "He isn't just sensing physical illness," she explained. "He's also responding to emotional states. When that man with the back pain arrived, angry about his job, Ranger would only lead him to the joint spring after he calmed down. It's as if he knows the healing won't be as effective if the person is emotionally agitated." She began to systematically document Ranger's interactions, creating a behavioral profile that revealed patterns even the dog's devoted owners hadn't fully recognized. Ranger adjusted his approach based on visitors' anxiety levels, mobility limitations, and even their receptiveness to the experience. For skeptical visitors, he was more persistent. For those who were afraid, he became more gentle and attentive. "In 35 years of veterinary practice, I have never seen anything like it," Dr. Brennan admitted. Her most startling discovery came when she performed a full health workup on Ranger. Blood work, joint mobility tests, and cognitive assessments all showed results typical of a dog half his age. "The regenerative effects of these springs on canine physiology are unprecedented," she told Arthur and Julia. "His cellular markers show an actual age reversal, not just an improvement of symptoms. Whatever is happening in these waters is altering biology at a fundamental level." With this scientific validation of what they had observed intuitively, Arthur and Julia's perspective shifted. What had begun as a personal cure, then expanded to helping their neighbors, now revealed itself as something potentially groundbreaking. "We need to protect this place," Arthur said one night as they discussed Dr. Brennan's findings. "If the wrong people found out about waters that could reverse aging and cure chronic disease," Julia nodded solemnly, "pharmaceutical companies would be all over it. Land developers would turn it into an exclusive resort. Everything that makes it special would be monetized or destroyed." The conversation was cut short by Ranger, who suddenly snapped to attention, staring down the access road with an unusual intensity. His posture was not the normal greeting for expected visitors, nor the alert for wildlife. There was something almost wary in his stance. "Someone's coming," Arthur said, reaching for his binoculars. Through the lenses, he spotted a luxury SUV navigating the rough road with obvious difficulty. Even from a distance, the vehicle's gleaming black exterior and urban cleanliness stood out as alien in the mountain environment. Ranger moved to stand between Arthur and Julia, his body language more protective than welcoming. A low growl rumbled in his chest as the SUV drew closer. "I don't like this," Julia murmured. "We have no appointments today." As the SUV parked beside their truck, the driver's door opened, revealing a face they hadn't seen in nearly 6 months. Their eldest son, Bradford, impeccably dressed in expensive casual wear that nonetheless looked completely out of place in the rugged setting. Ranger's growl intensified, and Arthur placed a hand on the dog's collar to restrain him. "Easy, boy," he murmured. Bradford surveyed the transformed property with undisguised shock. His eyes swept from the renovated cabin to the terraced garden, the solar array, and the carefully maintained paths leading up the mountainside. "Dad? Mom?" he called out. "Is that really you?" Julia stepped forward. "Hello, Bradford. What an unexpected visit. You both look incredible. The last time you saw us, we were broke and abandoned," Arthur finished, his voice calm but firm. "What brings you to Raven's Hollow after 6 months of silence?" "We tried to get in touch. No phone service, no reply to the letters." Bradford gestured at the thriving homestead around him. "It's obvious you've been busy. What exactly have you built here?" Before Arthur could answer, the passenger door opened and Diana stepped out, her lawyer's briefcase in hand, as always. She was followed by their son, Kevin, and Bradford's wife, Gracie, who eyed the rustic surroundings with ill-concealed distaste. Ranger's protective stance intensified. His body shifted subtly, placing himself more directly between the old couple and their approaching children. "My God," Diana exclaimed. "Mother, you're not wearing oxygen? And your hair, it has its color back." "The mountain air agrees with us," Julia replied evenly. Gracie stepped forward in pristine, impractical designer hiking boots. "And the dog survived," she observed with surprise, keeping a safe distance from Ranger. "Why are you here?" Arthur asked directly, making no move to embrace his children or invite them into the home he had rebuilt with his own hands. Bradford exchanged a look with Diana before answering. "We've been hearing stories about miraculous healing springs, about an elderly couple who've created some kind of wellness retreat, about a remarkable therapy dog who guides people to exactly what they need." He paused, looking pointedly at Ranger. "Sound familiar?" The atmosphere grew thick as the two groups faced each other. The abandoned parents who had turned exile into purpose, and the children who had discarded them only to return when something of value appeared. The standoff lingered, the tension stretching between parent and child like an invisible barrier. Ranger remained in his protective stance, his intelligent eyes moving from one visitor to the next with clear-eyed assessment. "Can we sit down and talk?" Bradford finally asked. Arthur hesitated. "On the porch, not inside." "You've done incredible things here," Diana began, her legal training evident in her careful phrasing. "The transformation is remarkable." "You both look healthier than you have in years," Kevin added, his tone more genuinely admiring than his siblings. "Last time we saw you, Mom, you could barely walk from the house to the car." Julia simply nodded. "Raven's Hollow has been good to us." "Let's not dance around it," Bradford cut in. "We've been hearing stories from the townspeople. They're calling this place a miracle spring. They say you've created some kind of healing sanctuary, and that your dog—" He gestured toward Ranger, who watched him without blinking. "Has become a local legend." "People talk," Arthur replied. "Mountain communities like their stories." Gracie leaned forward. "But these aren't just stories, are they? You're running some kind of resort. And this dog, this is a game changer." Diana opened her briefcase, pulling out documents with practiced efficiency. "We've been looking into the mineral and water rights associated with this property. The original 1952 claim includes extensive subterranean rights that could be quite valuable with the proper development." "Development?" Julia's voice grew sharp. "This is not a commercial venture." "But it could be," Bradford countered. "A wellness resort in this setting, with documented healing properties and the unique angle of a therapy dog. It's a gold mine." It's marketing gold. Kevin, who had been quieter than his siblings, finally spoke up. I could handle the business side. Turn this into a proper wellness retreat. Push the dog angle. People love animal therapy stories. Dogs become full-blown celebrities, Grace added. He could have his own Instagram account. We could monetize that. Where were you when your mother couldn't breathe? Julia's voice cut through their excitement. When we had $847 to our name and a collapsing roof? When we thought we might lose Ranger because we couldn't afford the vet bills? Still carrying her portable oxygen tank more out of habit than necessity, she stood with Ranger pressed against her leg. You left us for dead. We chose to live. The three of us. Bradford recovered quickly. We made mistakes, Dad. We were trying to do what we thought was best for everyone. For everyone? Arthur repeated. Or for yourselves? We're a family, Bradford insisted. This could benefit all of us. Obviously, the dog is well cared for here, too. Kevin, perhaps sensing the widening rift, tried a different approach. Mom, Dad, you've built something incredible, but you're not getting any younger. You need our help to manage this properly. Arthur stood abruptly, disappearing into the cabin and returning moments later with a briefcase. He pulled out several legal documents and handed them to Diana. As a lawyer, you'll appreciate this. I've transferred all mineral and water rights to the Ravens Hollow Healing Foundation, a nonprofit established last month. Your mother, myself, and, interestingly enough, Ranger, are all listed as lifetime trustees. Diana scanned the documents with professional speed. You can't name a dog as a trustee. Actually, a new voice said from the path leading up from the main road. In Colorado, you can designate an animal as a beneficiary, with human trustees acting on its behalf. It's entirely legal and in this case quite appropriate. Dr. Brennan approached the group, medical bag in hand, her expression pleasant but firm. Ranger immediately trotted over to greet her, his guard dog posture melting away into a welcome. And you are? Bradford demanded. Dr. Sarah Brennan, DVM, she introduced herself. I've been documenting the remarkable healing properties of these springs and Ranger's therapeutic abilities for the last month. She gave a respectful nod to Arthur and Julia. The foundation structure is quite sound, legally. I serve as one of the human trustees for Ranger's interests, along with 3 other local professionals who have experienced the benefits of the springs firsthand. You had time to arrange all of this, Diana observed. Yet you couldn't find time to call your own children. You didn't call us either, Julia pointed out. Not until you heard there might be something of value here. Perhaps, Dr. Brennan suggested diplomatically, this would be a good time for you to experience what your parents have created before continuing this discussion. The spring's perspective-enhancing properties might prove beneficial. Bradford looked ready to refuse, but Kevin surprised everyone by standing up. I'd like to see these famous springs, if they're really as remarkable as people say. Ranger, who had been watching the exchange intently, padded over to Kevin and circled him, sniffing. After a moment of consideration, the dog gave a soft bark and headed toward the path leading to the respiratory spring. I think he's inviting you to follow him, Arthur explained, his tone softening. The dog? Choosing which spring? Grace asked. Ranger has an uncanny ability to match visitors with the spring that best suits their specific needs, Dr. Brennan confirmed. We've documented hundreds of cases, and his accuracy is statistically impossible to attribute to chance. Kevin, slightly hesitant, followed Ranger down the path. After an awkward moment, Diana and Bradford decided to join the impromptu tour, with Grace trailing reluctantly behind them. Keep an open mind, Dr. Brennan advised. The springs have a way of revealing truths that go beyond the physical. Once they were alone, the doctor turned to Arthur and Julia with concern. I came as soon as I could when Harold called to let me know about your visitors. Are you all right? We will be, Arthur assured her. Sooner or later, we knew they'd find out what we've built here. The foundation structure should protect the springs from exploitation, Dr. Brennan reassured them. It was never about legal protection, Julia said quietly. It was about them only seeing us as useful when we had something they wanted. The visit to the springs produced mixed results. Kevin returned visibly affected, his breathing deeper and his expression thoughtful after soaking his feet in the respiratory pool. Diana maintained her professional composure, but couldn't hide her surprise when the joint pain she'd been secretly enduring for years eased after 41 minutes in the spring ranger selected for her. Bradford remained a skeptic, going through the motions at the skin spring, but emerging either unmoved or unwilling to admit he was. Grace refused to participate at all, standing at a distance and documenting the experience with her smartphone camera. The potential here is undeniable, Bradford insisted, shifting from an all-out commercialization pitch to a more moderate approach. You've created something remarkable, but proper management could help more people while ensuring the family's financial security. We're not interested in financial security as you define it, Arthur replied. Everything is a business, Grace countered. The question is whether it's managed properly or left to chance. Ranger, who had been lying quietly near Julia's chair, suddenly shot to his feet, his gaze fixed on the mountainside. A low, urgent growl rumbled in his chest, followed by an insistent whine. Dr. Brennan recognized the behavior immediately. He's sensing a weather shift, a significant one from his reaction. Arthur looked at the sky where clouds were massing, beginning to dim the late afternoon light. The risk of flash floods increases this time of year. When it rains hard up top, everything comes funneling down the old mining channels. As if to confirm his assessment, Ranger barked again, more urgently, and began moving between the assembled people and the cabin, clearly trying to herd them inside. We should continue this discussion tomorrow, Julia decided, rising from her chair. If Ranger says a storm is coming, we need to secure everything. Fine, Bradford agreed, but this conversation is not over. Within the hour, the storm's true magnitude became clear. What began as distant thunder rapidly escalated into one of the violent microbursts that occasionally ravaged the high country. Rain fell not in drops, but in solid sheets, while lightning turned the darkening sky into a strobe-lit battlefield. The cabin, now sturdy and weatherproof thanks to Arthur's renovations, became a refuge for the reluctantly reunited family. Ranger paced restlessly from window to window, monitoring the storm's progress with obvious concern. He never gets this agitated with normal weather, Julia observed. Dr. Brennan, who had decided to stay rather than risk the treacherous road, nodded in agreement. His level of alert suggests he's sensing something beyond the obvious storm. As night fell, the rain intensified to a solid roar against the roof. Periodic crashes indicated falling trees or shifting rock on the mountainside. The family's cozy cabin had become a fortress besieged by the fury of the elements. Near midnight, Ranger suddenly bolted from his watch post and dashed to the door, pawing at it frantically and letting out a series of sharp, demanding barks. He wants to go out? Diana asked, incredulous. In that? He wants us to go out with him, Arthur corrected. Something's wrong. Over Bradford and Grace's protests about the insanity of leaving shelter, Arthur followed Ranger out into the deluge, getting soaked instantly despite his protective gear. The dog led him not toward the springs, as he'd expected, but toward the truck parked near the workshop. In the beam of Arthur's headlamp, the reason became immediately clear. A torrent of water was surging down the mountainside, carving a new channel directly toward the solar array that powered their water pumps and Julia's medical equipment. The flood would destroy it in minutes. With Ranger leading the way, barking encouragement, Arthur managed to disconnect the critical components and move them to higher ground just before the wall of slurry and rock swept past. They returned to the cabin, soaked but successful, only to find Ranger already circling anxiously toward the other door. "He's trying to tell us something else," Julia realized. This time, Kevin offered to go, perhaps moved by the dog's obvious intelligence and dedication. With Arthur, he followed Ranger to the garden, where floodwaters threatened to wash away months of careful cultivation. Working in the driving rain, they dug an emergency diversion channel, redirecting the worst of the flow around, rather than through, Julia's precious plots. Throughout the night, this pattern repeated. Ranger would alert them to each new threat, a weakened section of the path that could compromise access to the springs, a shed where medical supplies were stored, the coop that housed their small flock of laying hens. Each time his warning came just in time to avert disaster. By dawn, the storm's fury began to abate, though the rain continued to fall. The exhausted group, mud-streaked and drenched, gathered in the cabin's main room, united by the shared ordeal. "That dog," Kevin said, shaking his head in awe, "saved this entire place. He knew exactly where every vulnerability was." "He's always been able to sense what we can't," Arthur replied. "It's why we're still here." The storm continued for 3 days, gradually downgrading from catastrophic to merely challenging. The roads were impassable, with bridges washed out and landslides blocking major routes. Dr. Brennan's satellite phone confirmed the entire region was effectively cut off, with emergency services focused on the more populated areas below. During this forced confinement, subtle shifts began to occur in the family dynamic. The children, stripped of their professional facades and luxurious surroundings, found themselves participating in the daily routines that kept Raven's Hollow running. Hauling water, shoring up structures, conserving food, and always following Ranger's lead when new threats emerged. A critical moment came on the 4th day, when Julia's supply of medication ran out. Though her health had improved dramatically, certain pharmaceuticals were still part of her regimen. With the roads impassable and no chance of a delivery for at least a week, a pall of worry fell over the family. "Mom needs her heart medication," Diana insisted. "There has to be some way to get supplies in here." Bradford, for once without a ready-made solution, paced the cabin floor. "Can we hike out? Find a road that's clear?" "Not safely," Dr. Brennan assessed. "The trails will be washed out in dozens of places. We'd risk becoming rescue victims ourselves." It was Kevin who noticed Ranger's unusual behavior. The dog had retrieved Julia's empty medicine bottle and placed it carefully beside a jug of mineral water they had collected before the paths became too dangerous. "I think he's suggesting an alternative," Kevin said slowly. Dr. Brennan knelt beside Ranger, examining his attempt at communication. "The springs have shown remarkable effects on cardiovascular health. Several visitors have reduced or eliminated heart medications after regular treatments. You can't be seriously suggesting we replace prescription medication with spring water," Bradford objected. "It's not just spring water," Arthur corrected. And we aren't suggesting anything. Ranger is. The dog, hearing his name, picked up the medicine bottle again and placed it directly in front of Julia. Then he nudged the jug of spring water toward her with his nose. Julia, who had observed the spring's effects more extensively than anyone, made her decision. I'll trust Ranger. He hasn't been wrong yet about what we need. Despite Bradford and Diana's protests, she began a regimen of drinking the water from the respiratory spring 3 times a day and applying compresses soaked in the water from the joint spring to her chest and neck. Dr. Brennan monitored her closely, checking her vital signs and watching for any worrying symptoms. To the astonishment of her children and Bradford's poorly disguised skepticism, Julia's condition not only remained stable but continued to improve. Her blood pressure is better than mine, Dr. Brennan announced on the 6th day, and her pulse is strong and regular. Whatever is in this water, it's supporting her cardiovascular system more effectively than her previous medication. As the isolation continued, the family settled into new patterns. Arthur led the daily repair efforts, guiding his children through tasks that slowly restored the infrastructure of Ravens Hollow. Diana, with her methodical mind, took charge of documenting the storm's aftermath and organizing the priorities for recovery. Kevin, proving surprisingly adaptable, became Arthur's right-hand man, discovering a hidden talent for tools and construction. Of all of them, Bradford struggled the most with the primitive conditions, his executive temperament ill-suited for their uncertain, moment-to-moment existence. Grace, after an initial refusal to partake in manual labor, eventually found herself helping Julia salvage what was left of the garden. In spite of herself, she began to learn about the medicinal herbs that supplemented the spring's healing properties. Throughout it all, Ranger remained the settlement's steadfast guardian and guide. He would disappear for hours, returning with news of passable routes, new dangers, or, on one remarkable occasion, a lost hiker whom he led directly to the cabin for shelter. "Your dog ought to work for FEMA," the grateful hiker remarked, while warming himself by the stove. By the 3rd week of their isolation, as radio reports hinted that the roads might soon reopen, Ravens Hollow had transformed. The storm damage, though extensive, had been largely repaired through the combined, now unified efforts of the group. Some improvements even surpassed the original structures. Kevin and Arthur had redesigned the paths to the springs with better drainage and more secure footings, while Diana discovered a knack for stonework, crafting beautiful retaining walls that stabilized vulnerable slopes. But more significant than the physical rebuilding was the emotional one taking place. The forced proximity and shared purpose had dismantled some of the barriers between parent and child. Working alongside Arthur, Kevin rediscovered the father who had taught him to build his first treehouse. In helping Julia with her medicinal herbs, Diana reconnected with childhood memories of her mother's gardening lessons. Only Bradford maintained a certain distance, his entrepreneurial mind still calculating potential instead of embracing the present reality. Grace, surprisingly, showed the most dramatic transformation. She developed a genuine fascination with the spring's properties and Julia's knowledge of herbal remedies. "My skincare routine costs thousands a year," she admitted to Julia one afternoon, as they applied spring water compresses to storm-damaged plants. "But nothing has ever made my skin look this good." "That's what we've been trying to tell you," Julia replied. "These springs aren't a business opportunity. They're a responsibility and a gift." The moment of truth arrived when rescue crews finally reached Ravens Hollow, nearly 4 weeks after the storm began. A team of paramedics and National Guard members trudged in, expecting to find desperate survivors in need of medical attention and evacuation. Instead, they discovered a thriving community, not just surviving, but flourishing in their isolation. The cabin was warm and well-stocked with canned goods. Critical infrastructure was functioning, with Arthur's improvised water purification system drawing admiration from the rescue team's engineer. The garden, though battered by the storm, was still yielding fresh vegetables that supplemented their diet. Most surprising to the newcomers was the health of those they had come to rescue, particularly Julia, whose medical records had flagged her as a high priority due to her previous conditions. "Ma'am, your oxygen levels are better than most people half your age," a paramedic named Jenny remarked. "And this dog, he's in remarkable shape for his age. What's your secret?" "Clean living, mountain air, and the best early warning system money can't buy," Julia said. Ranger seemed to understand the compliment, giving a slight wag of his tail, but his attention remained fixed on Julia, ready to respond to any sign of distress. As the first responders prepared to leave, dropping off emergency supplies but no longer insisting on evacuation, the team leader pulled Arthur aside. "I've been doing mountain rescue for 20 years, he said. "I've never seen anything like this place. Not just getting by, but thriving. And your dog, the way he led us up the only safe path here. Extraordinary." Arthur nodded. "Raven's Hollow takes care of its own. And Ranger, he's special." "So what happens now?" Kevin asked later. "We can't just pretend the last month didn't change things," said Bradford, who had been uncharacteristically quiet during the rescue team's visit. "I've been thinking about what this place represents. Not as a business, but as—" He trailed off, searching for words that didn't come naturally to his profit-driven mind. "As a sanctuary?" Julia offered. "That's exactly what it is," Julia confirmed. "The Foundation's structure protects it legally," Diana recognized. "It's actually quite brilliant, ensuring no single individual can exploit or sell the resources." Arthur nodded. "We didn't create this place to get rich. We created it because we were given a gift, and gifts are meant to be shared responsibly." Ranger, who had been lying quietly during the discussion, suddenly rose and approached Bradford, watching him intently. After a tense moment that felt like a judgment, the dog did something unexpected. He placed a paw on Bradford's knee, not as a greeting, but in what seemed a deliberate gesture of connection. "What's he doing?" Bradford asked, startled. "I think," Dr. Brennan observed, "he's acknowledging your change of heart. Ranger doesn't just sense physical needs. He reads intentions." "When we sent you up here," Brennan admitted quietly, "a part of me thought we might never see you again. That you—" He couldn't finish the sentence. "You thought we'd die," Arthur completed for him. "We told ourselves it was the responsible choice, that you'd be better off in a facility with medical care. But we knew what this place was like when we gave you the keys. A ruin where two old folks and an old dog weren't likely to survive a winter." "And yet, here we are," Julia said. "Not just surviving, but creating something meaningful, something that's helped not only us, but others." "So I'll ask again," Kevin said. "What happens now? Do we go back to our separate lives and pretend this never happened? Or has something fundamentally changed?" The next morning dawned clear and bright, the mountain air scrubbed clean by weeks of rain. Arthur rose early, as had become his habit, and stepped out onto the porch to find Ranger already alert, surveying his domain with watchful eyes. Together they watched the sunrise paint the peaks in shades of amber and gold, a moment of peace before the decisions that would shape all their futures. "What do you think, boy?" Arthur murmured. "Can people really change, or do they just get better at hiding who they really are?" Ranger looked up at him, those intelligent eyes seeming to hold a wisdom beyond animal understanding. Then, deliberately, he turned his gaze back toward the main cabin, where the family still slept. One by one, the others emerged into the morning light. First Kevin, who had taken to rising early during their isolation to help with morning chores. Then Julia and Dr. Brennan, deep in a conversation about the new growth they'd observed on the storm-damaged plants treated with spring water. Diana appeared with a notebook in hand, already documenting the day's recovery priorities. Bradford and Grace were the last to appear, still adjusting to a rhythm of life without electronic alarms and coffee delivered to their door. Breakfast became an impromptu council meeting, with homemade bread and preserved fruit from Julia's pantry serving as the only agenda items. For several minutes, they ate in companionable silence, the shared meal a continuation of the bonds forged in isolation. Finally, Bradford set down his cup and addressed the gathering with the directness that had made him successful in business. I think we need to discuss the future of Ravens Hollow, not as a commercial opportunity, but as a family legacy. Arthur studied his eldest son, looking for signs of the calculating businessman, but found instead a thoughtfulness that had been absent in their earlier confrontation. We're listening. Over these past few weeks, we've seen something remarkable here. Not just the Springs or Ranger's abilities, though those are extraordinary. We've seen purpose, meaning, the kind of authentic life that... He hesitated, then continued with uncharacteristic vulnerability. That many of us have lost sight of in our pursuit of success. Kevin leaned forward. So what are you suggesting, Bradford? We all move to the mountain and become hermits? No, Bradford replied. I'm suggesting that Raven's Hollow represents something worth protecting. Something bigger than individual gain. The foundation structure you set up, he nodded to Arthur. That ensures it. But maybe there's a middle ground between exploitation and isolation. A controlled expansion. A formal structure, Diana elaborated, that maintains the sanctuary nature of this place while making it accessible to those who truly need it. Arthur exchanged a look with Julia. What exactly are you envisioning? Bradford gestured broadly. Raven's Hollow as a healing sanctuary, not a commercial spa or resort, but a place where people with chronic conditions can come for extended stays, where the waters and rangers' guidance are available to those who need them most, not just those who can afford premium prices. And who would run this sanctuary? Arthur asked. You, Bradford replied. You and Mom with Ranger. You created this place. You understand its spirit. We could provide support, the legal framework, operational assistance, funding for improvements. But the heart and soul would remain yours. Ranger, who had been listening intently to the conversation, suddenly rose and approached Bradford. The dog circled him, sniffing, then sat directly in front of him, his eyes locked on the man's face as if searching for something beyond the words. After a long moment, Ranger gave a soft woof and returned to Arthur's side, his assessment complete, but his conclusion unclear. I think, Dr. Brennan interpreted carefully, that Ranger is reserving his judgment. He senses your sincerity in this moment, but perhaps he's waiting to see if actions match intentions. Bradford nodded slowly. Fair enough. I haven't given him, or any of you, much reason to trust me lately. Grace, who had been uncharacteristically quiet throughout the exchange, finally spoke up. There's something else we should discuss. She looked at Bradford. I've been documenting everything since we arrived. The springs, the improvements, Ranger's abilities. Initially, I thought it would make great marketing material, but now, Grace continued, I see it differently. This isn't a story to be exploited. It's a legacy to be protected. What if we created a proper documentation project? Not for publicity, but for preservation. Chronicling the healing properties, Ranger's techniques, the knowledge you've accumulated. Arthur looked at his daughter-in-law with new eyes. The ambitious marketer seemed to have receded, replaced by someone with a genuine interest in the unique properties of Raven's Hollow. There's value in documentation, he acknowledged, especially since Ranger's knowledge seems to extend beyond what even we understand. Dr. Brennan agreed enthusiastically. From a scientific perspective, proper documentation could be invaluable, not to commercialize the springs, but to understand them. There's healing potential here that modern medicine hasn't even begun to tap. The conversation continued through the morning, evolving from tentative suggestions into concrete planning. Diana's legal expertise shaped a vision for Raven's Hollow that balanced accessibility with protection. Kevin, surprising everyone with his practical insights, proposed simple infrastructure upgrades that could accommodate more visitors without disrupting the natural character of the place. Even Bradford, once focused solely on the profit potential, found himself drawn into the concept of sustainable stewardship over exploitation. His business acumen was redirected toward resource management and long-term preservation instead of immediate returns. Throughout the discussion, Ranger remained an attentive observer, occasionally moving to a different family member, as if monitoring not just their words, but their intentions. By midday, a new vision had begun to take shape. Raven's Hollow as a healing sanctuary with limited, carefully managed access. Visitors would come by referral rather than advertisement, stay in simple cabins built with minimal environmental impact, and experience the springs under guidance that honored their special properties. Most importantly, the sanctuary would operate as a non-profit, with any revenue beyond maintenance costs directed toward research and preservation. It could work, Arthur conceded, if the focus truly remains on healing instead of profit. And if Ranger approves of the visitors, Julia added, his judgment of character has proven far more reliable than our own. The family's emerging consensus faced its first test that afternoon when a truck appeared on the newly cleared access road. Harold Jansen climbed out, moving with remarkable agility for a man who had once been crippled by hip pain, followed by his wife, Margaret. Behind them, 3 more vehicles pulled up, carrying local residents who had become regular visitors to the springs before the storm. Heard the road was passable again, Harold called out in greeting. Brought some supplies we thought you might need, and some folks who've been missing their treatments. Ranger immediately trotted out to greet the newcomers, circling each person in his customary assessment, before guiding an elderly woman with trembling hands toward the path to the joint spring. Arthur introduced his children to the visitors, watching their faces as they witnessed Ranger's therapeutic process firsthand. The dog moved with a quiet professionalism, assessing each newcomer before guiding them to the appropriate spring. At times he would retrieve specific items to enhance their treatment. A cushion for proper positioning, a ladle for drinking from a particular fount, or herbal additives from Julia's garden. I've never seen anything like it, Diana murmured, her eyes fixed on Ranger as he led a man with labored breathing toward the respiratory spring. It's like he's practicing medicine without a license. Better than most doctors I've seen, Harold commented from nearby. That dog knew what I needed before I even said a word. I've been pain-free for months, after years of specialists telling me surgery was my only option. As the afternoon wore on, more visitors arrived, the news of the reopened roads having spread quickly through the local community. Each person was greeted by Ranger, assessed, and directed, and each brought with them a story of healing that defied conventional medical explanation. Bradford, observing this procession with a growing sense of wonder, turned to Arthur. "You've built something extraordinary here. Not just the springs, but this community. These people, they trust you. They trust that dog." Arthur nodded, his gaze sweeping over the scene. "The mountain chose us, not the other way around. We're merely its stewards." 17 visitors, Dr. Brennan noted, looking up from her notes. Each directed to a specific spring, each reporting improvement. Statistically, that's impressive. As evening fell, the family gathered once more around the dinner table. The day's events had deepened their understanding of Ravens Hollow's importance, not just to them, but to the world beyond their property line. "I think we've been asking the wrong question," Kevin said thoughtfully. "We've been focused on what happens to Ravens Hollow, but maybe the real question is what happens with us. How do we fit into what Mom and Dad have created?" Bradford nodded slowly. "You're right. This place doesn't need our permission to exist. It was healing people long before we showed up, and it will continue to do so long after we're gone." He looked directly at his parents. "The question is whether we are worthy of being a part of it." "I think," Arthur said softly, "that's a question Ranger can help us answer." As if on cue, the dog rose from his resting spot and approached the table. He moved deliberately from person to person, spending a moment with each family member in an assessment far more thorough than his usual greeting. When he reached Bradford, the dog paused for a long time, his intelligent eyes locked in a silent communion. Then, to everyone's surprise, Ranger pressed his head firmly against Bradford's chest, not as a gesture of affection, but as if he were listening to something deep within the man. After a long moment, he stepped back, let out a single sharp bark, and returned to Arthur's side. "What was that all about?" Bradford asked, his voice a little unsteady. Dr. Brennan, who had been documenting Ranger's behavior, spoke carefully. "I believe he was checking your heart. Not metaphorically. Literally." "My heart? Why would he do that?" Bradford trailed off, his face paling. "Brad?" Diana asked, her brow furrowed with concern. "What is it?" Bradford's voice was low when he finally answered. "I've been having tests. Irregular heartbeat, chest pains. Nothing conclusive yet, but serious enough to make you think about your mortality." Dr. Brennan added, "Ranger senses these things. It's part of why he's so effective at directing people to the right springs." Julia reached across the table, her hand covering her son's. "Why didn't you tell us?" A flicker of the old defensiveness crossed Bradford's face. "Would you have believed me?" "We would have believed you," Arthur said, his voice firm but gentle, "because Ranger would have confirmed it." Bradford looked at the dog, a new understanding dawning in his eyes. "So, when he led me to that specific spring on the first day," he began. "He was treating your heart condition," Brennan confirmed. "In the same way he has guided your mother's treatment. His diagnostic abilities are extraordinary." The revelation transformed the atmosphere around the table, dissolving the tension of negotiation into something more vulnerable, more authentic. Bradford's admission explained so much: his driven behavior, his urgency to secure assets, his focus on legacy. Ranger, having completed his rounds, returned to Bradford and nudged his hand insistently. "I think he's suggesting you need another treatment tonight," Arthur interpreted. Gracie, seeing her husband's vulnerability laid bare, let her usual poised facade fall away. "Please, Bradford, go with the dog. Whatever he's sensing, just trust him." In the soft lantern light, Bradford followed Ranger down the path to the largest of the springs, the one Julia used for her respiratory ailments, but which, according to the old journals, also aided matters of the heart. The rest of the family followed at a respectful distance, now united in their concern. At the spring, Ranger directed Bradford with gentle nudges into a specific position where the water cascaded over a smooth rock shelf. With Dr. Brennan providing medical guidance, Bradford submerged himself in the warm, mineral-rich water. The tension visibly drained from his body as the spring worked its subtle magic. "I can feel it," he said after several minutes, his voice filled with awe. "I can feel my heartbeat stabilizing. It feels stronger, more regular." Dr. Brennan monitored his pulse. "Your rhythm is normalizing. Whatever minerals are present in this particular spring, they're having a direct effect on your cardiovascular system." Bradford looked up at his parents, his eyes glistening in the dim light. "I came here thinking I could help you. Instead, you're saving me. Again." Arthur shook his head. "It wasn't us, son. It was Ranger. Sometimes, we have to let go of control to find our healing." The night air was filled with a profound silence, as if the mountain itself was acknowledging this moment of reconciliation. Ranger sat sentinel at the edge of the spring, his intelligent eyes moving between Bradford and his parents, the steadfast guardian of a legacy that now spanned generations. In the days that followed, a new understanding settled over the Whitlock family. Bradford, humbled by his health scare and Ranger's intuition, abandoned all pretense of taking over. Instead, he offered his business expertise to help establish the Ravens Hollow Foundation, a legitimate healing sanctuary with proper legal protections. Diana, moved by the spring's effects on her own chronic pain, volunteered to create the comprehensive legal structures that would shield the property from exploitation while ensuring its accessibility to those in need. Her professional network provided access to conservation experts who could help preserve the fragile ecosystem around the springs. Kevin, always the most adaptable of the siblings, discovered an unexpected talent for designing and building the simple, elegant structures needed to accommodate visitors. Working alongside Arthur, he reclaimed the construction skills his father had taught him as a boy, finding a satisfaction in tangible creation that his former career had never provided. Gracie, in perhaps the most surprising transformation, became fascinated by the documentation project. Her social media expertise, once focused on projecting an image of artificial perfection, was repurposed to capture authentic stories of healing. With Dr. Brennan's guidance, she began creating a comprehensive record of Ranger's therapeutic techniques and the spring's effects. Through it all, Ranger remained the heart of Ravens Hollow. His ability to assess visitors, direct them to the proper treatments, and monitor their progress became the cornerstone of the sanctuary's approach. Dr. Brennan's ongoing documentation established a scientific credibility for what might otherwise have been dismissed as folklore or placebo. "What you've created here," she told Arthur and Julia one evening, "is a model for integrative healing. The springs provide the minerals, Ranger provides the guidance, and the community provides the support. It's what medicine should aspire to, but so rarely achieves." 6 months after the storm that had forced their reunion, A fully fledged Raven's Hollow welcomed its first formal group of visitors, seniors with chronic ailments that conventional medicine had failed to resolve. The selection process, overseen by Dr. Brennan and a committee of health professionals, prioritized need over the ability to pay, with a sliding scale ensuring access for all. Ranger, now the official director of therapy, with human handlers as his legal proxies, greeted each arrival with his signature assessment routine. Age had not diminished his abilities. If anything, his prolonged exposure to the springs had enhanced them. At 11 years old, he moved with the vigor of a dog half his age, his once grizzled muzzle now showing more black than white. "He's like a living example of what the springs can do," Kevin remarked. The medical Benjamin Button. The sanctuary's reputation spread carefully through professional networks rather than commercial advertising. Doctors with patients who had failed to respond to conventional treatments began to make quiet referrals. Research institutions proposed carefully managed studies of the water's mineral properties and rangers' therapeutic techniques. Bradford, now dividing his time between the mountain and his business responsibilities, underwent a transformation as profound as the physical changes in his parents. His heart condition, managed with regular treatments under Ranger's guidance, stabilized to a degree that his cardiologist described as a medical anomaly. During one of his visits, he brought his teenage children, who had previously been too consumed with private schools and scheduled activities to visit their grandparents. Initially skeptical and glued to their phones, they gradually succumbed to the magic of Raven's Hollow, and especially to Ranger's uncanny ability to perceive their unvoiced emotional needs. "Grandma," Bradford's daughter asked Julia one evening, "how does Ranger always know exactly what's wrong, even when we don't say anything?" Julia smiled. "He listens with more than his ears. He listens with his heart. It's a skill that most humans have forgotten." The girl considered this. "I think I'd rather learn what Ranger knows than get more followers on Instagram." That simple moment of connection illustrated what Raven's Hollow had become. Not just a place of physical healing, but a sanctuary where deeper wounds could be mended. The children who had once cast their parents aside now found themselves drawn back, not by obligation, but by a genuine desire to be part of something meaningful. Kevin eventually moved into a small cabin on the property, his architectural skills enhancing the sanctuary as he gradually stepped away from his old career. Diana maintained her law practice but refocused it toward environmental protection and elder rights, with Raven's Hollow as her touchstone for authentic purpose. Even Gracie, once defined by material acquisition, found a new identity documenting the sanctuary's stories. The most profound transformation, however, remained with Arthur and Julia. The couple who had arrived, broken and discarded, now stood at the center of a thriving community, their wisdom and experience valued rather than dismissed. "We thought our story was ending," Arthur reflected one evening as they sat on the porch. "Instead, it was just beginning a new chapter." Julia nodded. "The mountain showed us we still had a purpose." Ranger, lying contentedly between them, raised his head at the sound of their voices. At 11 years old, he showed no signs of slowing down, his eyes still bright with intelligence. "And you, old friend," Arthur said to the dog, "you knew it all along, didn't you? That this place was waiting for us, that we were meant to be its guardians." Ranger's tail swept the porch floorboards in a gesture that seemed like agreement. Then, suddenly, he rose to his feet, ears pricked toward the access road, his posture alert but not alarmed. Minutes later, a vehicle appeared. It was Kevin, returning from town with supplies. But he wasn't alone. Beside him sat Dr. Brennan, and in the back was an unexpected visitor, a German Shepherd mix puppy, her markings strikingly similar to Ranger's. As the truck parked, Ranger trotted out to meet them, his attention immediately fixed on the puppy. The younger dog stepped out cautiously and approached him with a mixture of deference and recognition that seemed beyond normal canine behavior. "I found her at the town shelter," Kevin explained. "Something about her just reminded me of Ranger, so I had Dr. Brennan take a look." The veterinarian watched the two dogs interact, her expression one of professional fascination.